Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. So any of you seeking coffee, you're not going to have it. You need to wait at least an hour. I've given, I think, firm instructions not to allow caffeination outside of breaks. And so I would encourage all of you who are mingling to take your seats because we have foreign ministers from the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, from the United Arab Emirates, and the National Security Advisor of the United Kingdom, who are ready to address you on another rather broad theme, but which permits them to pick out for themselves the questions that they think are most important. The title of the plenary is Defense Diplomacy and Regional Stability. Yesterday, in the remarks I made at the opening dinner, I referred to a new feature in the politics of this region, the wider Middle East, but specifically the Gulf. And I said this region is going through a process of what I called strategic self-determination. We all know about political self-determination, in which peoples attain their national independence and their sovereign structures. But I think now we are in a phase of strategic self-determination. We're having established those national structures. Countries in this part of the world are seeking to develop their strategic personalities and finding fresh ways to do so with friends and partners from outside. So I think that is really one of the background features for this second plenary, and that's why it's so wonderful that we have with us the representatives that we do, and I will ask them each to take the podium in the order in which they are listed on the very recently printed agenda. But to remind you all, first, our good friend Adel Al-Jubair, the Minister of State for Foreign Affairs of Saudi Arabia, then our good friend Dr. Anwar Gargash, Minister of State for Foreign Affairs of the United Arab Emirates, and then our good friend Sir Mark Sedwill, National Security Advisor and also Cabinet Secretary in the United Kingdom. So with those introductions, could I ask, please, first, Adel Al-Jubair to take the floor. Thank you.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Good morning, everybody. John, thank you for the invitation. It's always a pleasure to be here in Bahrain for the Manama dialogue. The issue of defense diplomacy and regional stability is a very broad one, as you mentioned, John. What we're dealing with in the region is basically two competing visions, a vision of light and a vision of darkness. The vision of light seeks to empower youth, empower women, seeks to develop the country, seeks to instill a culture of technology and innovation, seeks to diversify its economy, seeks to improve the living standards of its people, and seeks to live in peace with everybody else. This is what we in Saudi Arabia and generally in the Gulf are aspiring to do. The vision of darkness seeks to inflame sectarian passions, seeks to export a revolution, and seeks to dominate the region, and basically is based on death and destruction. That's what Iran is doing. It's the two visions, the competition of these two visions, that are the source of instability in the region, and mainly because the dark vision is the one that is inflaming all of this. When we look at our region, we look at Lebanon, we look at Syria, we look at Iraq, we look at the Gulf, we look at Yemen, we look even beyond the region, in Africa and in Asia, we see the destructive hand of Iran in all of these areas. What we have learned over the past, since the Khomeini revolution of 1979, is that appeasement does not work. The Iranians have to make up their mind whether they want to be a revolution or whether they want to be a nation state. If they're a revolution, you cannot deal with them. And if they're a nation state, then they ought to behave like one, respect international law, respect the sovereignty of nations, and stop interfering in the affairs of other countries. The Iranian Revolution today reminds me of the Soviet Revolution. When the Soviet Revolution succeeded in Russia, we had two competing visions: Trotsky, permanent revolution, and Lenin, revolution in one country. Had Trotsky prevailed, Would the European powers have stood by and allowed the Soviet Union to expand? Of course not. And the same approach ought to be taken with the Iranians. Iran must understand that the world is united against it. The world must unite against Iran and make it clear that there's behavior that is not acceptable. Killing diplomats, blowing up embassies, engaging in sectarianism, interfering in the affairs of other countries is not acceptable. So if we want to have regional stability, we must have an international coming together to make it clear to the Iranians that this behavior is not acceptable. When the foreign minister of Iran gives assurances to the United Kingdom and to Gibraltar that a ship carrying crude oil is not going to dock in Syria, and the ship docks in Syria, we have two issues here. Either the minister is being disingenuous, which is terrible, or the minister does not know what his government is doing, which is probably even worse. And so appeasement has not worked with Hitler. It will not work with the Iranian regime. The attack against Abqaiq and Khurais is a clear indication that the Iranians thought they can get away with it. We have asked the international community, the United Nations, to provide us with inspectors, and we have asked a number of friendly countries to participate in the investigation, and the results of the investigation will be revealed. What is absolutely clear is that these missiles and drones are Iranian-made, and the attack occurred from the north, not from the south. So we hold Iran responsible for this, and we expect the international community to take steps in order to extract a price from Iran. We have made it very clear that we don't want war. War is destructive to everybody, but at the same time, the Iranians cannot be allowed to get away with this. And so we are in consultations with our friends and allies about what steps and what measures to take after the conclusion of this investigation. So, can we talk to the Iranians? That's not the question. Can we have dialogue with Iran? That's also not the question. The question is Iran willing to abandon the principle of exporting its revolution, which is enshrined in its constitution? Is Iran willing to accept the principle of the sovereignty of nations? Iran claims that every Shia belongs to it, which is ridiculous. That's like saying every Catholic belongs to Italy. Would Germany accept this? Would France accept this? Why should we in the region accept this? Is Iran prepared to respect international law and the principle of non-interference in the affairs of other countries? Three simple principles. If they agree to those, we will have regional stability and we can have an effective dialogue. But how can you talk to somebody whose objective is to destroy you? Didn't the United States and Israel refuse to talk to the PLO because the Palestinian Charter called for the destruction of Israel? It was only when former President Arafat abandoned this concept and removed it from the Palestinian National Charter that the Reagan administration engaged with the Palestinians. If you ask this of the Palestinians, is it too much for us to ask this of the Iranians? And so the principle of international relations since the Treaty of Westphalia in the 1600s was based on sovereignty of nations and based on rules-based international system. We cannot have it be ripped apart by revisionist states such as Germany under Hitler, the Soviet Union under the communists, or Iran today. Iran is a great nation with a great history, with a great people. The Iranian people are moderate people. The Iranian people deserve better, and we ought to help them by making it clear to the current Iranian regime that if you want to be an accepted member of the international community, you should behave as one. You should behave according to the principles of this international community. The thought that sanctions would be removed against Iran is ridiculous. Iran has done nothing to deserve this. So why are people thinking about this? The idea that perhaps engagement will cause the Iranians to change their behavior has not worked in 40 years. Why would it work in the next 4 years? So the key to regional stability is deterrence. The key to regional stability is a steadfast position by the international community to make sure that everybody has to abide by the rules of international law, that's how we can bring about a change in Iran's behavior. If Iran chooses to continue along its destructive path, sanctions should be increased, not reduced. And so we in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia would love nothing more than to see Iran become an accepted member of the international community. But in order to do that, it has to do what I mentioned in terms of the three principles. Abandon the principle of exporting the revolution, accept the sovereignty of nations, and respect international law and the principle of non-interference in the affairs of other countries. We have had more than 110 countries condemn the Iranian attack against the facilities in Saudi Arabia. That's a very clear message to the Iranian regime that the world will not accept this. We have had the chiefs of staff of 18 countries meet in Saudi Arabia recently in order to see how we can set up a principle of deterrence onshore and on sea. And we are working with our friends and allies in order to set up a system that would ensure deterrence in the Gulf and prevent Iran from engaging in another attack like this. I think I'll probably stop here and be happy to take questions from you. Thank you.
Adil, thank you very much. And you remind people in your remarks about not just the difficulties of having constructive engagement, but also how one verifies any commitments that are given. In a narrow and technical arms control agreement, it's quite easy to set up structures to see if people are acting in or out of compliance with the agreement. When you are asking people not to export a revolution, to respect sovereignty, and to work within international law, the verification measures for that are probably a little bit more difficult, and I hope there will be some chance for imaginative discussions to how, were such an agreement to be arrived at with the Islamic Republic of Iran, people will have confidence that the agreement would be carried through in fact and on the ground. With that, could I introduce to you all again, you know him so well, Dr. Anwar Gargash, Minister of State of Foreign Affairs of the United Arab Emirates. Please.
Thank you very much. It's always very difficult to speak after Adil Jubair. But I'll try. First of all, I have to say I'm very delighted to be here, the 15th IISS Manama Dialogue. This is really proving to be the most eminent, really, platform for regional strategic issues in the Gulf. Any conversation about regional stability, I think, cannot be separated from events beyond our borders. It seems appropriate to briefly reflect on this before I turn to the topic of our discussion. We're entering the 2020s with a global order that's very fluid, and it seems to lack a clear direction. This is very concerning. A fully stable world order is a rare thing. But in this global order, some of the assumptions that we once took for granted no longer stand. And I'd be happy to discuss this further later on our discussion. In short, we're confronted with a new world order where the potential for increased competition among major powers is growing, including in the Middle East, where we continue to see growing divisions on a number of critical international issues. Similarly, the past 2 decades have seen unusual regional interference in Arab affairs. Turkish, Iranian interference in the whole Arab regional space, which adds, in our assessment, to the overall instability of the system. For the Middle East, a region that's seen immense challenges recently, these dynamics not only provide an opportunity to look forward towards various levels of cooperation, they also provide an opportunity for regional states to look inward, reassess their strategies for effective statecraft and effective diplomacy, ultimately determine what kind of Middle East we wish to inhabit. And I think this links a little bit to what Adil said in the beginning of his remarks. How can the Middle East overcome its challenges? And more to the point, how can we effectively use diplomacy to build a regional order that will provide stability and security for all countries of the region? What else do we need to succeed? I think from the UAE's perspective, we are no stranger, like all countries in the region, to making difficult decisions in a difficult region at difficult times. We recognize that the various crises and escalations we have seen recently in our region require effective diplomacy in a rules-based global order. A strong system of regional international alliances and proactive diplomacy can help determine how these crises unfold and what they bring. It's also essential that we resurrect the concept of an effective and moderate Arab core. In this, we see Saudi Arabia as core in the GCC, and we see Egypt as core, but as Ayman Safadi spoke in the first session, other countries like the UAE and Jordan, Morocco, and others need to be there. I think this concept of an Arab core is extremely important. It's been quite elusive so far, but clearly our position, for example, vis-a-vis the Turkish invasion of northeast Syria from the Arab League was the sort of thing that we need to do together. There are some reasons, I think, also for optimism. Together with partners, including the United Nations, the United States, Europe, the African Union, I think we have persistently sought to play an enhanced diplomatic role in addressing the region's many challenges. I think one big success, for example, to give an example here, has been the Riyadh Agreement, which Saudi diplomacy successfully engineered. This is an essential, really, building block towards the stability that we see in Yemen. And I think here you have a clear example of the strength and power of diplomacy and what it can do towards stabilization in the region. And as I said, we're hoping that this also will be a major building block in our common work together to try and get a political solution in Yemen. I think another example is Sudan. So Sudan, again, you see a very effective Saudi role, you see a very effective UAE role together with the United States, the UK, the EU, the African Union, and clearly that transition was another real success. And of course, we need to continue also to support Sudan. But these are clear examples where regional countries can actually play an important role in making diplomacy work and making diplomacy effective. If diplomacy is to be successful as an instrument of statecraft in our region, it should always seek to minimize hostilities, assist in the development of effective conflict prevention and conflict resolution. In this context, I must also emphasize the importance of creating a shared economic zone. I think more and more, if you look at many of the examples of the GCC, for example, this is a shared economic zone. The intra-GCC trade in 2003 was $6 billion. Today, that intra-GCC trade is $130 billion. So clearly, I think along with diplomacy, we need also to put a positive vision, a vision of stability, a wider vision, as we see many young people take to the street from Iran to Iraq to Lebanon. I think it should be about working the diplomacy, putting the pressure on, but also putting together a view with regards to future stability. We are, to be honest, in confronting what has been an expansionist Iranian policy for the last 30 years. And clearly this policy has been one of the major roots of instability in the region. Now, the word confronting doesn't extend to the word war. It means confronting. And I think that we are all, quite conscious that this policy of confronting Iranian expansionism is important. But I don't think any one of us is actually calling for an open confrontation in a neighborhood that cannot afford more open confrontations. But it doesn't mean also that, sometimes the issue is presented as if it's a choice between a return to what we see as an adequate JCPOA or war. And I disagree with that sort of false choice between the two. I think there's still a lot of space between a return to the JCPOA, which is something that is, you can't do it anymore, or war. I think there's a lot of diplomatic space between the two. And if by defense diplomacy we understand the connection between foreign policy objectives and defense, then defense diplomacy does not have to be about rivalries and competition, as has often been the case in the past, but about working together to overcome challenges and give diplomacy a chance. So clearly we do need to look at diplomacy as an option, but it is not the way many of the Iranians think that it is just go back to the JCPOA and everything will be fine, because we will actually go to a system that has not worked, and we are where we are now because the system has not worked. The region needs clearly here also to look at priorities. The Iranians would like the discussion to be about the JCPOA, but clearly they cannot really evade a major discussion about ballistic missiles, and especially the way that we have seen ballistic missiles being used in the past couple of years. Ballistic missiles are a major threat to stability in the region, and we have seen Iranian ballistic missiles used liberally in several areas of tension in the region, and I think this is something that needs to be addressed, and it needs to be actually upfront in any sort of diplomatic effort. In this fluid world, whether this be trying to contain Iranian interference, confronting the threat of terrorism and extremism, looking at Yemen, resolving humanitarian challenges, overcoming regional conflicts, we believe regional states must do their fair share in carrying the burdens of the region. I think the Yemen crisis was a major test for us. But really, when you look at it, at the end of the day, the geostrategic balance was severely challenged, but did not shift. We still don't have a changed geostrategic challenge, and I think this is a main reason for this is because the countries of the region took upon themselves to defend the geostrategic status quo. And I think that is very important here, as I would say, at quite an immense cost. We need, I think, as we move forward also, we need to promote positive reform agendas, which encourage successful sovereign states that consistently deliver for their people's aspiration. The sense I get from watching the popular protests in Lebanon and Iran is that the region needs a governance framework that addresses many of the economic and social concerns of the younger generation. I mean, interestingly, Lebanon has an electoral system. Interestingly, Iraq has an electoral system, and they have political parties, etc. But clearly, what we are seeing is that the cut and paste approach, the sectarian approach, does not work, which means that the region does need a governance structure that is, I would say, homegrown, one that addresses the issue of governance, addresses the issue of corruption, and addresses really the issue of efficacy of government. And I think this is essential as we move forward. Ultimately, a new and more stable regional order will need to be underpinned by a renewal of Arab states and values with a strong moderate core at the center. I mean, we are really tired of being used as somebody else's geostrategic space. We are tired of being Turkey's geostrategic space. We're tired of being Iran's geostrategic space. And I think the only way to address that is for an Arab order that actually works better and rejects the idea that you sort of secure your influence and secure your security at the expense of Arab space. Let me be clear here, the Arab world must have strong states. As recent events have shown, we cannot afford to wait on moving forward on the fundamental priority of this region. Our region has suffered more than most from the impact of weak states. So clearly institutions are a major linchpin, really. I mean, when you look at today the crisis that we see in Lebanon, the institution of the military is essential in holding the country together, which has been driven, which is really breaking at the seams because of past sectarian policies and because of the inability to address really the needs of a much more modern, much younger demographic, really, in providing opportunity and so on and so forth. So strengthening the role of the state is critical, not only for creating a more stable regional order, but also in providing the prosperity so urgently needed by the region's people. In this effort, it is essential that the international community support the role of moderate countries in building this vision. Regional countries must be allowed to follow their own path to develop their own solutions. I close by saying I don't underestimate the difficulty of the task. Building this new regional order will not be without its challenges, nor will it come without periods of crisis or dysfunction. However, if we do not strive to achieve a more positive vision, we will never unlock the full potential of the region. As we will need to take further actions in support of regional stability in the months ahead. I think for us, the UAE, we are a willing partner, but clearly we are a mid-sized state in a very difficult region, and we clearly understand the importance of building Arab alliances, regional alliances, and of course keeping and strengthening our international alliances. Thank you very much.
Shukran jazeelan. Thank you. Thank you very much, Anwar, for asserting that there is a very large space between rehashed JCPOA and outright and open war, and for your comment that cut-and-paste sectarian constitutions do not work. My editorial addendum to that is that it is possible to have multi-ethnic political harmony without constitutionally mandated quotas for political office. And I think that probably is another definition of good governance that I know a number of countries in this region are striving towards. With that, could I invite the National Security Advisor and Cabinet Secretary of the United Kingdom, Sir Mark Sedwill, to address this plenary.
John, thank you very much. First, on behalf of Her Majesty's Government, may I thank His Majesty and the Government of Bahrain for your hospitality. It's great to be here at this 15th Manama Dialogue, and John, to you and your leadership on this effort. This has become a critical forum in addressing the various challenges that we have faced, and it's an honour to be here with you today. I will return to some of the acute questions that have essentially dominated the discussion so far in a moment. It is always, at events like this, natural to focus upon those issues that are of greatest preoccupation. Yemen, tensions with Iran, the frozen Arab-Israel issues, the civil war in Syria, the spread of terrorism and instability across the region. But there are some other trends as well at an event like this that we should be looking towards and thinking ahead through the remainder of the next decade, through the 2020s, to the challenges that this region, like others, will face. Because while those acute issues are those that fill my in tray and those of other people in jobs like mine and those of my honoured colleagues, the two foreign ministers, our governments and think tanks and others at events like this do need to think ahead to some of those bigger trends that we face. And so let me just touch briefly on those as well, since they will affect the defence and diplomacy in this region as they will in our own. First is the shift in global geopolitics. We are back into an era of strategic competition. That's the underlying concept of the latest United States national security strategy. And we've seen with the shift of the global centre of gravity to the Pacific, the US-China relationship will essentially define for the next quarter of a century or more not only the course of the world economy and global security, but actually the future of the planet itself, in that we can't address the big environmental challenges we face, from biodiversity to plastics in the oceans to climate change, without the leadership of the big two. But of course, we also have, as we've just heard, that geopolitical strategic competition in this region and in particular with Iran. Second, we're seeing a changing nature of competition and conflict. Strategic threats are now hybrid. Competition and confrontation, as you'll hear at a session tomorrow, are now operating in the grey zone. We've seen, as Florence Parly mentioned earlier, issues that we thought had become taboo, such as the use of chemical weapons, piracy, armed attack, the use of deniable, apparently militias, cyber attacks, disinformation, dirty money, subversion. Activities that we had hoped with the end of history had died out are back and alive and well. And in this era, reinforced by not plausible but implausible deniability. As we saw with the attack on the Aramco facilities, while all of us were crystal clear about the origin of that attack, it wasn't one that was an explicit hostile armed attack. And so how do we restore, in that era of implausible deniability, and my word, we've seen plenty of this in our own theatre in Western Europe from Russia, where we see the full spectrum version of this operating in Ukraine and elsewhere. How do we restore deterrence and a means of containing these threats in the modern era when we're facing a full spectrum set of activities operating across the grey zone? Third, there are some huge demographic challenges that face us. There are immense opportunities as well. The technological revolution, of course, is the most striking. But with demographic change, by the middle part of the 21st century, every part of the world except sub-Saharan Africa will have an aging population. And there will be gaps between the number of jobs that are available for those young people and the numbers that are there. And so we'll see huge migration pressures of a kind that certainly outweigh those that we've seen so far. We see more instability within countries than between countries, and greater inequality within countries than between countries than we have seen before. In this region, climate change is going to have an immense effect. This region has over 6% of the world's population, less than 1.5% of the world's water, and climate change will affect that. It will also have a huge economic effect. As Western economies, and indeed economies worldwide, the Chinese economy as well, move towards low and zero carbon, then hydrocarbons over the next few decades will become less a source of energy and more a source of raw materials. In the UK, we're working towards developing fusion power, which has the opportunity to utterly transform the energy provision in Western economies. And that, too, will have a dramatic effect on the geopolitics of the world, which have been so dominated by that competition for natural resources in the past. And so in this region, as you see here in Bahrain, but also in the Emirates and in Saudi Arabia, we're seeing economic diversification. away from an overdependence upon the production of that essential raw material to other forms of economic growth, and that will change the nature of our economic and geopolitical relationships. So what is the upshot? How do we deal with this? Well, in the UK, we've thought hard about this in our recent capability reviews of how do we assemble all of our national capabilities in the most effective way possible to deal with the challenges, improve our resilience, and exploit the opportunities of the 21st century. We call that, in our national security area, the Fusion Doctrine, but essentially it's a new brand on a very old idea that goes back all the way to Sun Tzu and some of the great thinkers of many centuries ago. And it's essentially about assembling all of our capabilities, security and defense capabilities, economic capabilities, influence, work on sustainability, behind all of our national objectives. The UK is still the only country in the G7 and one of only a handful in the G20 to both meet and exceed the NATO target of investing 2% of our national income in defense and 0.7% in international development. We have a global diplomatic service. We have world-class law enforcement, security, and intelligence agencies. We campaign on the issues that matter most to the rising generation, and we have institutions that reach beyond governments and states into the hearts and minds of people worldwide that they trust. And of course, most important of all, we have alliances and partnerships around the world on which we can rely. I've come to this conference from a similar but different one at the Atlantic Future Forum, which was meeting in the United States aboard our new fifth-generation supercarrier, HMS Queen Elizabeth, which was moored off Annapolis in the United States and hosted a conference similar to this. And that talked very much about some of the kinds of issues that we're facing here, but obviously in the Euro-Atlantic context. And we talked there about how, in that context, but also here, defense and security, we will have to extend beyond the traditional three domains of land, sea, and air into the fourth and fifth domains of space and of cyberspace, and develop the same concepts of defense and deterrence in those. But also, in this era of full-spectrum strategic competition, extend beyond defense and security into other areas of the economy, and of hearts and minds. And that means, for us, working not only through NATO, but through the OECD, the G7, the G20, and others too. And of course, what it means in this region is ensuring that the GCC and other regional security arrangements are docked into a wider level of regional cooperation and stability. That involves ensuring that Iraq plays a full part again as an Arab nation, and that the Arab world is able to bring its nations together in unity to face the challenges and exploit the opportunities of the future. This remains a region which trades less with itself than with many other parts of the world. And so economic integration and some of the efforts that have been led by my colleagues on the panel here are an important part of developing regional security and stability. And we look forward to the Saudi presidency of the G20 as an opportunity to advance that agenda. So what does this mean for defense and diplomacy in this region? Well, of course, so much of that depends on the issue we've already heard much about this morning, and Iran. Like France, like other nations, my nation believes in peace, but peace through security. Richard Holbrooke, a friend and mentor of mine, with whom I worked on many diplomatic issues, including some of those where we had tensions between NATO nations and between allies, sometimes commented that diplomacy is not actually about talking to your friends. It's about finding a means of dialogue with those with whom you have differences and in some cases are your adversaries. Kofi Annan memorably commented that diplomacy is the right approach, but diplomacy backed by force and firmness is more likely to succeed than diplomacy without. So for the UK, we will continue to invest in our partnerships in this region, government to government, business to business, economy to economy, and people to people. We have a university, a British university here in Bahrain, and many more of those contacts as well, and we're deepening our economic partnerships and our trading relationships. But we will also continue to invest in the hard power and the smart power and the sharp power required in this region. The UK participates in the international maritime security construct. I'll be going to the Naval Support Facility here in Bahrain, where we have our forces based later today, and we will continue to work with the nations of this region on their capability development, whether that is equipment, which often is the issue that grabs the headlines, but actually more importantly, ensuring that the training, the doctrine, the professionalism and expertise of the armed forces of this region are as we have, operating with the same professionalism as we've seen when we fought alongside each other in Afghanistan and in other theatres. And the number of leaders in this region who've been to Sandhurst, who've taken the Sovereign's Parade is, of course, a matter of pride for my country and just a symbol of the deep defence partnerships that we have established and which will continue. The JCPOA with Iran has come up a couple of times this morning, and I think it is important just to remember where we might have been if that agreement had not been reached. It is not perfect, and it is only an arms control agreement, not a comprehensive agreement designed to restrict what was the increasing pace of the Iranian development of a nuclear weapons capability. And they were getting closer and closer to a breakout capability when the JCPOA was signed and agreed, and it has been successful in impeding that program. Just imagine the kind of conversation we'd be having and were we facing a nuclear arms race in this region and beyond. And it is imperative that we avoid that. Now, of course, it would be optimal to be able to reach a comprehensive agreement that dealt with all of the issues that the countries in this region face from Iran. The use of militias, the destabilization of other nations, the broader export of their ideology and the sectarian tensions that they seek to exploit. But if we can't achieve in the short term a comprehensive agreement, then we will need a mix of policies, as you referred to earlier on, John, which is to contain some of that malign influence in the areas that are most exposed to it, and we need to do so robustly, but also when we're dealing with these strategic issues, to ensure that we have, whether it's the JCPOA or a replacement, a series of arms control agreements that ensure that the threat from nuclear capability, from ballistic missiles, etc., is contained. And that's how we've managed it with other potential conflicts in the past when we have maintained strategic competition, different ideologies. In the past, notably during the Cold War, we were able to find a way of containing the worst risks through arms control, and the JCPOA is a means to that end. And of course, can be replaced, but it must be replaced by an agreement that has the same effect of ensuring that Iran does not develop a nuclear weapon and that this region does not face a nuclear arms race, which would be catastrophic, not only for the security of this region, but for the security of the globe. So let me conclude by reiterating the UK's commitment to the security and stability of this region, our investment in the defence and capability of the armed forces, of our partners and allies here, our commitment to maintaining our presence to ensure the freedom of navigation in the Gulf. We've had several frigates involved in that operation, and that will continue. I would expect to see one or more of our carriers regularly in this region when they become operational in the next year or so, at the heart of allied carrier strike groups, but also on that platform of deeper defence and security cooperation, the broader people-to-people, business-to-business, government-to-government cooperation on which true relationships and friendships that endure are founded. Thank you very much.
Mark, thank you very much for that very powerful powerful statement. Many people will have taken away some thoughts from your elucidation of the UK Fusion Doctrine. I might add that the United Kingdom has usually been an extrovert strategic actor, and one of the continuing contributions that perhaps the UK can make is also in sharing best practice in developing good strategy, which is, I think, an important role that can be played. And on that point, given that so much talk at this conference has already been about asymmetric threats and hybrid challenges, it's worth recalling that in the UK, there was a implausibly denied attack on UK soil that was not a formal armed attack on one of the member states of NATO, but did threaten the security of the United Kingdom. And it fell in, not in the famous Article 5 contingency of NATO, but in the Article 4 contingency that allowed the United Kingdom quickly to whip up diplomatic support and renounce the Russian activity. And perhaps one of the strategic best practices that could be shared with this region is how does one develop Article 4 type thinking in the Gulf, and then be able, at equal speed, to be able to assemble a coalition of the willing proportionately to respond to such an implausibly denied, but nevertheless security-challenging attack. Can there be an Article 4 contingency within this environment? The floor is open. I'm going to take a number of comments and short questions, and then return to the panel, and then, yes, you will have a coffee break after that. The first to catch my eye, Karen Young from the United States.
Thank you very much. My question is for His Excellency, Dr. Gargash. The United Arab Emirates has always been consistent in its understanding of the nexus between development and security, and has devoted a lot of its foreign aid and foreign investment to that priority. I wonder if you could tell us what are the current geographic priorities for the UAE, and how do you prioritize given limited resources? Is it the Sahel, Egypt, Pakistan, Libya, Yemen, Horn of Africa? There's a wide spread of resources currently. And how would you make that effort more multilateral? In particular, in my view, the United States right now is not very understanding of that nexus. So how do you draw support? Thank you.
Thank you. And from the Netherlands, Adnan Hassan.
Thank you very much. Dr. Gargash spoke about shared economic zones and touched on youth. And it seems to me that the region has one of the highest percentage of youth. And economic diplomacy is, in fact, might even be more important for regional stability than hard force. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, of course, at 782 billion, is at the heart of the GDP in the region, and with the G20 and reform process is very key to the future. How do you see the vision for a regional economic order playing out, and how do you see both the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the UAE playing a role in that? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And also from the United Arab Emirates, Ebsem Al-Ketbi, please.
Thank you, John. ابتسام الكتبي مركز الإمارات للسياسات. إذا فهمت من كلام معاليك أستاذ عادل الجبير، ولما أقارنه بالدكتور أنور قرقاش، المسألة واضحة أنها زيرو سم جيم، المعادلة في المنطقة. وبالتالي ما هي الجهود التي ممكن تقنع إيران؟ طبعا هي زيرو سم جيم في ظل عدم التوازن. مشكلة دول الخليج مع إيران، مشكلة النظام الأمني في الخليج وهيكل الأمن في الخليج، هذا عدم التوازن بين دول الخليج وإيران. كيف ممكن نقل هذه المعادلة من zero sum game إلى win-win game. ما هي رؤية دول الخليج؟ هذا السؤال مطروح أيضا على معالي الدكتور أنور قرقاش. شكرا.
Thank you. And from Bahrain, Noura Hamed Al-Amer.
Thank you for the floor. Just to let you know that my intervention is going to be slightly longer than the others because it's just very enlightening, and I just want to thank the panelists to start for the open way of speaking today. And
thank you, but make your intervention crisp.
I will. It will be crisp, but it will be a bit lengthy. I just first want to apologize to Mr. Adel Jubair because I actually missed his talk, so I won't be touching upon it too much. However, just to introduce myself, I'm Noor Al-Amar. I represent the Supreme Council for Environment, where my work primarily concerns climate change and sustainable development. I'd like to talk about something near and dear to my heart, which is sustainability. However, it won't be environmental sustainability, but rather economic sustainability and the sustainability of our societies. There was talk about ballistic missiles and piracy, which I'm not familiar with. However, I want to talk more about defense diplomacy. And there was talk from Mr. Anwar Gargash that we do not have to be rivals, and we should boost competition. And in the GCC, I think that's a very, very fair model where we do have trust, fairness, and cooperation. And with that huge jump from 6 billion to 130 billion, I think there's a lot to be said about that. When it comes to the younger generation, and being a youth delegate today, I think a lot of what the younger generation, not just my generation, but younger than me, a lot of it's out in the open of what they would like, and it's seen in recent revolutions. And there was also, I think also Anwar Gargash spoke about not talking to your friends, but your adversaries. Or sorry, that was maybe Mark said, well. And I think taking this wisdom from the older generation and seeing as there isn't going to be an aging population in the future, using that in order to come up with sustainable solutions for our economies, for our environment, for our societies. So I'll jump right to the question then, since I've really extended my intervention. I wanted to ask Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and the UK how they have reached out to this younger generation to mold the future, this so-called new order, and how we're going to sustainably move on. Thank you.
Noura, thank you very much. You used your time exceptionally well. Good. Thank you. Raf Sanchez from the UK.
Good morning. Firstly, to Sir Mark, the UK has repatriated a small number of British orphans from Syria this week. Should we expect any further repatriations of British children or adults, or is this the limit on how many people the UK is prepared to take back? And what do you say to criticism from British allies like the US, Turkey, and the Syrian Democratic Forces, who say that Britain is failing to live up to its responsibilities by refusing to take back its citizens? And to Minister Al-Jubair, you spoke of the need to deter Iran in the region, but so far there's been no significant response from Saudi Arabia to the Iranian attacks on its oil facilities. What do you say to observers in Tehran and elsewhere who conclude from this lack of response that when push comes to shove, Saudi Arabia does not have the will to stand up to Iran? Thank you.
Thank you. And from The Economist, Shashank Joshi.
Thank you very much. Can I ask Sir Mark whether you agree with Minister Florence Parly's statement earlier that the present maritime initiatives are structured in ways that are associated too closely with America's campaign of maximum pressure, whether the structures are such that many countries won't join, and whether you also agree with her that NATO needs to go from brain dead to brainstorm and requires a new mechanism to discuss the future of the alliance, and particularly her specific point that allies are no longer taking into account the interest of others.
Thank you. And from Egypt, Yasmin Farouk.
Thank you very much. I have two questions. The first one is to His Excellency, Mr. Adel Jubair. I would like to actually build on the Chairman's question about what concrete steps would you like to see Iran taking to start building confidence measures with the Gulf countries, And the other question is where. So what step and where, in which file, in which country. The second question is to His Excellency Mr. Gargash about this Arab Corps and the need to build Arab solutions to Arab problems. So my question is, do you think this means building on existing projects that have failed to develop into something more effective, or actually starting over or initiating new projects, such as, for example, the current project for a Middle East strategic alliance, but that also involves the United States?
And from the United States, David Merkel.
Thank you, Dr. Chipman. Speakers this morning have been quite clear on the importance of the United States to this region. Yet when looking at the actions or inactions of the current and previous administration, many, and I would include myself among them, say that we are less predictable and even may be unreliable. I'd be curious what the foreign ministers think the United States, what actions the United States could take to regain that view as the United States as a reliable partner.
And with apologies to the dozen or so people who still have sought the floor, but I can't give them the floor in this session, and an assurance that I will give them priority in the next, could I ask for the last intervention before I return to the panel, and that is from Fatima Al-Sarafi from Bahrain.
Thank you, Dr. Chipman, and thank you, Your Excellencies, for a very comprehensive session. My question to the panel is, how can defense diplomacy be achieved in light of asymmetric attacks that pose a new challenge to the region? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'll ask each of the panelists to take a couple of minutes to respond to the questions posed to them and generally, and I'll do it again in reverse order if I may. So I'll call first on Sir Mark Sedwell, then Dr. Anwar Gargash, and we'll include with Minister Adel Al-Jubair. Sir Mark.
John, thank you very much. So let me just pick up a few of the points that were addressed to me. Noura Hamid Al-Amr asked about how do we address the younger generation. And I referred to this very briefly, but for the UK, this is as much about the broader campaigns that we are involved with, whether that's prevention of sexual violence in conflict, modern slavery, the illegal wildlife trade, plastics in the oceans, biodiversity, and of course climate change. These are issues which are preoccupations of individual political leaders, but they're also issues that speak to, as a whole, speak to the preoccupations of the younger and the rising generations in many, many countries, and that are really not issues that tend to be the issues of political debate between countries, even though they are issues within them. So for us, it's about demonstrating that the UK is one of those countries that is addressing the issues that preoccupy them and preoccupy, of course, our own younger generation as well. Build on that, the kind of contacts we get through huge interchanges through tertiary education and so on, then I think we can show that to that younger generation there are opportunities in becoming part of the global political dialogue, and in particular the global political dialogue on environmental issues. Raf Sanchez asked about Syria. We have just repatriated a group of very young orphans. These are young British citizens who, for no fault of their own, because of the decisions of their parents, have found themselves in a war zone, and we felt it was the right thing to do once we were able to do so, to repatriate them. And if others find themselves in the same circumstances, and it is possible to do so, then the same principle will apply. But people should not underestimate the practical challenges and security challenges of doing that safely. The primary responsibility, of course, for the welfare of those children is the parents who've in effect abused and victimized them by taking them to a war zone and allowing them to be indoctrinated in the first place, but they're Brits and we have a responsibility to them. You also asked about foreign fighters. We want foreign fighters dealt with through, those that are captured, dealt with through the justice system, but they have to be dealt with through the justice systems in the most appropriate place possible. So if we can bring them back to the UK and put them through our criminal justice system and deal with them appropriately, we will. If it is to be done, if it is better done elsewhere, then we will work with allies to do that. And of course, many of the crimes that these individuals have committed have been committed, for example, against our allies and partners in Iraq, and it may well therefore be appropriate for them to be dealt with there. But they will be dealt with, and they'll be dealt with in the most appropriate place, possible. Shashank Joshi asked about the international maritime security construct here in the Gulf and whether it's too associated with the doctrine of maximum pressure. So we're clear that we think it is right for us to participate in that. As Florence Parly said, it is entirely appropriate that there can be other constructs alongside it. I'd note, however, that the IMSC is the only one that is currently operative, which is why we and others are involved with it. But it is about the security of securing freedom of navigation, the security of the maritime zone in the Gulf. It is not about applying pressure, maximum pressure to Iran. These are distinct objectives, and the British government does not have maximum pressure on Iran as part of our policy, but we do have participating actively in securing these vital shipping routes in the Gulf, and we will continue to play an active role in that. You'll understand that I think the brains in NATO are alive and well, but I think brainstorming, as John suggested, is always a good idea. But there are some underlying questions which Florence Parly referred to. Not enough European allies in NATO are yet investing 2% of their GDP in defence, a commitment they made at the Wales summit 5 years ago. And add to that not only the quantum, but the capability itself, the actual readiness of forces, and we have Jim Mattis's initiative to improve, when he was Defence Secretary of the United States, to improve that readiness. There is a great deal that European allies need to do. So, of course, we should always be thinking, particularly as I said earlier, as we have to extend the alliance's concept of defence from the traditional domains into the fourth and fifth domains of space and cyberspace, and look at the relationships beyond the pure security into that wider set of questions. So if we're to secure our interests, our economic and geopolitical interests, then we need not only NATO capabilities, but national capabilities and EU capabilities as well in the Euro-Atlantic area. Then, of course, we need to think constantly about how do we do that in the most effective way. You also asked about allies taking into account the interests of their allies in pursuing their foreign policy. I mentioned Richard Holbrooke earlier, with whom I worked quite closely in the 90s and the early 2000s. I recall him having to broker a really quite dangerous dispute between two NATO allies, Turkey and Greece, in the mid-1990s over missile deployments into islands in the Eastern Mediterranean. So this is not the only time, this current incursion into Syria is not the only time there have been tensions within the alliance between allies, often actually sharper tensions than is the case at the moment. If you have an alliance with multiple interests of that kind, you don't have to agree on everything, but you do have to maintain the core values of the alliance. And finally, in a related point, Fatima Saifi asked about asymmetric attacks and how do we deal with that. Well, John mentioned earlier how we dealt with the chemical weapons attack in Salisbury, and to some extent that's what the UK's Fusion Doctrine is about. But let me, if you take our label off it and think back to several thousand years ago and to Sun Tzu, who made the point that you should choose the battleground on which you fight. You don't choose the battleground on which your adversary wishes to fight, because that, if they're smart, will be the area that they are strongest. You choose the battleground on which they are most vulnerable and on which you are strongest. And therefore, operating against asymmetric attacks, whether those are cyber attacks, whether those are deniable militia attacks, whether those are state-sponsored terrorist attacks or whatever, does not necessarily require us to respond in the same domain and in the same way. We must actually always respond in accordance with our own values as well as our own interests. But we can create pressure. We can ensure that our adversaries pay a price, and in particular a price higher than one that they were anticipating, by responding in areas that play to our strengths and to their vulnerabilities. So in responding to that attack, we assembled alliance action, one of our capabilities being our allies, a capability that not all countries enjoy, in order to ensure that there was a higher price paid for that act than had clearly been anticipated. And there were some other actions that we took alongside that, including covert as well as overt actions that have ensured that they realise that this behaviour is not only unacceptable, but a price will be incurred for it. And that kind of example, I think, is how we're going to have to think about operating as our Chief of Defence calls it, manoeuvre in the grey zone and deal with asymmetric challenges. Thank you, John.
Mark, brilliant. Thank you very much. Anwar.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I'll try and pick up also on some of the remarks here. I think the first thing, this idea of a nexus between development and security. I mean, again, the important thing is as we see a more fluid international order, as we see more in regional intervention in our affairs, in Arab affairs, etc. It's not like we are seeking to play a larger security role, but we understand also our world today is not the world of the 1980s, where we had what I would say a more defined international system. So some of these challenges are challenges that are imposed challenges that are very much also linked with the priority of stability in the region. At the same time, we recognize also that for you to have what I would call a more valuable and more sustainable relationship with friends and allies, you also have to deal with their concerns. And I think this is part and parcel also of our contribution to operations in Afghanistan. You have to also, in a very changing environment, you also have to add value in terms of what your partners are doing. And I think if you take the Sahel, for example, I mean, here you have two important things merging. First of all, what we see as a priority for the UAE, which is this confrontation with extremism and terrorism, very much as a UAE priority. But at the same time, we also recognize that for countries like France, the challenge in the Sahel is major. And we would like to add value to what our partners are considering as priorities, because we also need to call upon them for what we consider are our priorities. And I think this is more or less part of our thinking. Now, we're not a large country, so we do have limited resources at the end of the day. We're quite, I would say, creative also, as we have shown in Yemen, in how we operate. But at the same time, we recognize that our resources are not limitless. So from that aspect, it is important that we move in groupings, collectively. And I think this is what we are trying to do. So clearly, we're not really looking for an outsized role, but we also recognize that a return to how countries in the region used to operate 30 years ago this is a totally different landscape. And I don't think the way that one operated 30 years ago is relevant in the same way today. And as you saw with the question here on US policy in the region, for example, the United States, in my assessment, will remain as a very important player here. But certainly the role and the extent of the role of the United States is very fluid currently, because there is an internal discussion that has stretched for several years about how deep is the United States going to be involved there. Now, I mean, we're here observers, but I think also by showing our larger partners that we can actually do this whole issue of burden sharing well, and we have along the years done that with our capacity in the Balkans or Afghanistan or Libya or other places, that this is going also to make sure that that partnership is extended and that partnership is more solid. I want to speak about two issues here. So clearly, regional leadership, the regional role is very important. Now, the issue of economic prosperity. I would argue that Gulf countries, from Saudi Arabia to some of the UAE and other Gulf countries, have always pursued what I would consider a developmental model. We're, in various conversation with our leadership in the UAE, it is consistently about housing, it's consistently about services, it's consistently about youth, it's consistently about education, and so on and so forth. This is like a daily conversation that we have. It's not a conversation really about politics, etc., regional politics, etc. And I would say that in many ways, many of the Gulf countries in their model, which is criticized by others as rentier models, but it is consistently about social and economic policy. And I think what I would like to see is more of that discussion in the region. And as I said, I mean, the GCC, regardless of its current political conditions, is actually working as a common market. It's working very well as a common market. And there are umpteen examples of how the GCC is working every day for the citizens of the GCC, even though we do have a problem that is a political problem with one of the countries. So I would say, as we really watch the daily demonstrations in Iraq and in Lebanon, we recognize very clearly that it is foremost about the efficacy of the political system, of the economic system. It is secondly about corruption. So it's really about delivery and it's about governance. And I think this is something that we need to do. And I think from that perspective, on this zero-sum game with Iran, we do need to, out of the current crisis, I think there looms an opportunity. I'm not sure Iran will grab that opportunity, because that opportunity means that Iran has to change the way it has been operating in the region. It has to respect the fundamentals of sovereignty. It has to respect the fundamentals of non-interference and so on and so forth. But on the positive side, what we need to offer, but we have to talk first about stability, about being more of an ordinary region in its state-to-state relationship. And I think right down there in that vision, we need to come and look, and that is really the carrot in any sort of looking forward 20 years down the road, of a region of economic prosperity that is Arab-wide, but that can also include other countries in the region. I feel we are far away from that still, but I think that discussing that will also show that this is not really just a game of politics where it's about how much you win, how much you lose, but it is also about how much we all win together. And I think this is the only way that we can break the zero-sum game that Dr. Ibtisam Al-Kutbi spoke about. Thank you.
Dr. Anwar, thank you very much for that last encouraging visionary point, and also for asserting the intimate relationship between good governance and security, and reminding us that alliance cohesion means respecting the priority of others as you demand or seek their respect for your own. Final word to Adel Jubair.
Thank you, John, and thank you, everybody, for the questions. I'll start with, there were a couple of questions about Iran and about how we switch from a zero-sum game to a win-win game, as well as what concrete steps the Iranians can take and where. Very simple. The Gulf countries have not escalated in order for us to de-escalate. All the escalation has come from Iran. We didn't attack their embassies, we didn't kill their diplomats, we didn't sponsor terrorist groups inside Iran, we didn't recruit militias inside Iran. So it's really one-sided. And it's up to the Iranians to decide if they want to move towards a situation in which everybody benefits. How can we measure this? Very simple. We measure it by their behavior. Stop supplying terrorist groups with ballistic missiles and funding and training. Stop setting up militias, sectarian militias in other countries. Stop planting terrorist cells in other countries. Stop threatening freedom of navigation in the Gulf. These are all very, very easy to verify. That's how we judge whether Iran's behavior has changed or not. There was a question about youth. Saudi Arabia's population, 70% of which are under the age of 30. That is why the kingdom has launched Vision 2030 under the leadership of His Royal Highness the Crown Prince. The idea is to diversify our economy, as I mentioned, open up new areas for investments, recreation, entertainment, tourism, mining, instill a culture of innovation and technology, empower women and youth, open up the public space for people so that we provide opportunity for our young so they can realize their hopes and their dreams and their ambitions, and in the process make us a more prosperous and a stronger nation. That's the objective that we're talking about. And what Dr. Anwar talked about with regards to the commitment and preoccupation of our leaders with the welfare of our citizens is something that I totally share. The idea is, how do you take your country to the next level, and how do you improve the living conditions of your citizens, and how do you provide opportunities to them? And I believe in the Gulf we have succeeded very well so far, and I believe that in Saudi Arabia with our Vision 2030 we will succeed even more, God willing. There was the issue of the lack of response from Saudi Arabia. We have made it very clear that Iran is responsible. We have made it very clear that we will take our time and make sure that we investigate the incident completely so that there is not a shadow of a doubt as to who did this and from where they came. And we have asked the United Nations and other countries to provide us with experts to look into this. We are consulting with our allies and friends with regards to the measures we should take in response. I would say we have been strategically very patient. And we will make the decisions when the time comes, and when the announcement is made, we will be very deliberate, and we'll be very effective, and we want something that works. We have said all along we don't want war. And so to jump into war very quickly is not a rational position. So we're looking at this, and we expect that the international community will move with us in ensuring that Iran is held accountable, and there are consequences to Iran for the actions it took. There's a question of the US allies and how we view the US, and the idea of the US being or retreating from the Middle East or not being dependable. We don't agree with that. We believe that the United States is a very dependable ally. We believe the United States has been a dependable ally for the last 7 decades. America has interests. America makes decisions. A few years ago, there was the famous pivot to Asia. What has happened since? American military presence in the Gulf increased, didn't decrease. American supplies of sophisticated technology and weapons to the GCC countries increased, didn't decrease. America is involved in the region. We don't see an American withdrawal. There's a desire in the US historically to try to retreat from the international scene, but that desire is not reflected in America's posture. The US, and rightfully so, asks its allies to share the burden of defense, and we in the Gulf have more than carried our weight with regards to the US. The US is involved in the region because the US is the world's sole superpower, and it's the largest economy in the world, and it has interests all across the globe. And any instability in one end of the world is going to have an impact on American interests, whether they're commercial or whether they're strategic, and that's why the US is involved in the international affairs, and that's why the US will continue to be involved in international affairs. So we have no doubt about America's commitment. The other issue is how do you achieve defense in light of asymmetrical warfare? Very simple, by giving up on appeasement and making it very clear that even asymmetrical warfare is not acceptable. If the international community stands shoulder to shoulder and makes it clear to the Iranian regime that this behavior is not acceptable and that there will be consequences for its actions. That's how we bring about change. Thank you.
Adel, thank you very much. Well, we have had sharp declarative sentences, zero question avoidance, and multiple policy suggestions. So I think that's a successful morning. Please do take your coffee break now. Return by 5 minutes to 12. You have 25 minutes. And as you stand, do give an ovation to our three panelists who've spoken now.